Hi everyone, and a very good afternoon, and welcome to the latest in our Euronews Debates series. My name is Damon Embling. I'm a journalist with Euronews, and I have the pleasure of moderating this session for the next 60 minutes or so. So this session today is called Nation Branding in a Changing World. And we've got a great panel of guests lined up to discuss this topic this afternoon. And if you do have any questions, any of you in our audience this afternoon, for any of the panelists or for me or for anything that you hear about during this discussion today, just leave your comments and questions in the comment section just below the video screen where you're watching. Just before I introduce our guests, what exactly are we talking about then in terms of nation branding? Well, many countries around the world have long been obsessed, haven't they, with reputation and image. And for most countries, that's meant the so-called nation branding has been a big part of their strategies to win revenue, to win business, to get consumers coming into the countries, including tourists. But where does that all stand now? Not only have we had the COVID-19 pandemic, which has been wreaking havoc right around the world, affecting foreign direct investment and also tourism flows, there's also been continuing social and political unrest in some countries as well. Obviously, with the pandemic, the rollout of vaccines is stoking hopes now of a rebound over the coming months and the coming years. And many people think that the countries that have their nation branding strategies right are probably going to be the ones that emerge the winners out of all of that in terms of attracting people back to their countries and attracting important business and revenue. So in terms of that nation branding strategy going forward, including in a post-COVID world, what do countries need to be thinking about? Do they need to be reassessing their image and reputation and their branding? Or do they need to leave it as it is? If they had the time during the COVID pandemic to rethink all that? And will their unique selling points be enough going forward? Well, there's some of the key things that we'll be discussing this afternoon. But of course, as I say, if you want to add to the debate as well, you're more than welcome. Leave your comments in the comment section just below the video where you're watching. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. So, without further ado, let's introduce our great lineup of guests that we've got for this debate this afternoon. Now, 4 people in total with me today. First of all, we'll go over to Cambridge in England, and we've got John Tipple, who's the Global Chief Strategy Officer with Future Brand. Hi to you, John.
Hey everyone. Great to be here.
Nice to see you, John. Thank you very much indeed. Looking forward to your contribution today. Also in England, in the east of England, we've got Simon Antholt, who's a policy advisor and international relations expert. Hi to you, Simon.
Mute.
You're on mute, but I think we've got the hello there. Thank you very much.
Sorry, classic mistake. I said hello.
We always have at least one of those in one of our debates. But everybody else now will certainly not have their buttons on mute. Daniel Valverde, he's the Nation Brand Director with Essential Costa Rica, and he joins us from Costa Rica this afternoon. But it's good morning to you, Daniel. Thanks for getting up nice and early for us. Nice to see you. And last but not least, we've got Dr. Natasha Grand, who's the director for the Institute for Identity, or INSTID, and she also joins us from the UK for this debate today. Hi to you, Natasha.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for watching this debate.
Yeah, and thank you very much indeed for joining us. So we're looking forward to your contribution as well, Natasha. So, nation branding. On the face of it, it seems quite an easy term, doesn't it? But it can actually be quite divisive in terms of the concept of nation branding, what it means, and how different countries interpret it. John Tipple, if we can go to you, first of all, in the UK at Future Brand, when I say nation branding to you, what does that mean?
Well, it's a great question. I mean, there's an old saying in branding that reputation arrives in a handcart and leaves in a Ferrari. And I think that that's true of most brands, but actually country brands, it doesn't actually apply to. Country brands are sort of different. That's certainly the evidence that we've seen through our research. We did research last year in the middle of the crisis, looking at perceptions and images of the top World Bank top 75 countries. What we found was Japan, Switzerland, Norway, Germany, Canada. Those countries were in the top 5 before. They're in the top 5, now, and UK, China, US. We expected those countries to really bumble around. They didn't. They sort of stayed pretty much where they were. So for us, country branding is something that is unique. It's a unique set of capabilities. And if you think about it, when we think about a country, we think about it in slightly different ways. We don't think about regular brands in terms of their heritage and culture or their opportunity to do business or perhaps their ability to attract you as a tourist. So there's a unique set of associations with country brands, and it's the ability to think about all of those or some of those that makes the difference.
You describe yourself as a global brand transformation company at Future Brand. Is it about just slapping glossy images of a country around the world and hoping people will like them?
Yeah, no, of course it isn't. I think what's really interesting, if you look at some of the countries that have done I think the effect of COVID in many ways has asserted what people already kind of thought. I mean, we expected to see big shifts. We didn't see them. I think people go into we think of, say, the US as big and dramatic. COVID was a demonstration of how big and dramatic they can be. We think of China as being orderly and kind of getting things done. They've certainly done that with COVID. We think of the UK as being kind of, I don't know, a sort of world-class amateurs, I guess. But I mean, I think we have this sort of, broad image of a country, and it's made up by a whole series of associations that in many ways we can't, we don't necessarily articulate. We blink, we think of these places, and it's built up over a lot of years, a lot of time, and it's through a lot of lenses. So when you get something that's acute, like a pandemic, in our experience, it sort of asserts what you actually think, or in many cases, it improves your perception of a country that might not have been on your radar. I mean, Thailand is a great example of a country, New Zealand, another one, that have come into our consciousness, not just as a destination for holidays or not just being great at sport and being naturally beautiful. These are countries that have demonstrated, their ability to have clear infrastructure, to be embracing of technology, to be able to mobilize and engage their people, to work together, to create a sense of momentum, and to look at, and to respond to the crisis, to the pandemic. And I think that's incredibly rejuvenating, and creates lots of opportunity to think afresh about countries that perhaps might have just been perceived as the images that you've seen slapped on holiday brochures, or through the lens of through some of their cultural global expression. I think of All Blacks rugby. I think New Zealand was often just expressed through things like that. Now we think of New Zealand in a whole broad suite of contexts, partly due to the way that they've responded as a nation to something like the pandemic.
Okay, John, thanks very much indeed for that. We're going to talk a lot about the impact of the pandemic in a few moments, but I just want to kind of concentrate for a little while longer on this concept of nation branding and what it means to each of you. I'd like to go to Simon Anholt now, who's a policy advisor. Simon, I think if I call you a nation branding expert, you're going to press that leave meeting button, aren't you?
Thanks for reminding me. No, I don't know.
What does it mean to you then?
I feel partly responsible for all this confusion because I'm usually accused of being the guy who invented this term back in the late 1990s. And I did use the term nation brand in a paper, and various people have suggested that was the first time those two words ever appeared together in print. It's not much of a distinction, but the reality is that nation brand means something quite different from nation branding. Nation brand is just an observation. The countries have got images, and those images are obviously very important to them. And much research has proved over the decades that countries with powerful and positive images trade at a premium. Everything is relatively easy. Everything is relatively cheap if people like you, know you, and trust you. Countries that have got weak or negative images trade at a discount. Everything they do is harder and more expensive and slower. So there's absolutely no question that the image of a country in today's globalized world is incredibly important. It's one of the country's most valuable assets. Where I start parting company with many others in this field is in the notion that you can do something called nation branding. In other words, if you're not happy with the image your country's got, there's a way of manipulating it. There's a way of managing it, usually using commercial marketing techniques, advertising, public relations, logos, slogans, all of those magic tricks. And the belief is that you can somehow, by spending enough money on these kind of tricks, force people to believe something new about your country. Now, it's just not true. I've been measuring the images of countries since 2005, and in fact longer. An enormous amount of data collected on this, and there is absolutely no correlation whatsoever, zero, between the amount of money that governments spend on promoting their images and the quality of those images. It just doesn't work.
Well, that's fascinating, isn't it, Simon? Because some countries spend millions and millions of dollars, euros, pounds every year on this kind of stuff.
Absolutely. And if you say to them, why are you doing this? On what evidence base? Because call me old-fashioned, but I think if you're spending taxpayers' money on anything at all, it has to be measurable and transparent.
Well, how do you make it measurable then if it's not going down that avenue? What do you advise the governments and organisations? I know you've worked with many right around the world, haven't you?
Yeah, well, I think it is measurable. It absolutely is measurable. If people are changing their minds about your country, first of all, it's nothing to do with your propaganda efforts. It's nothing to do with what you're saying about yourself. It's to do with how you're behaving. And that does take place, but it takes place over a very, very long period. So the two miracles of nation branding, if we must use that term, are probably Japan and Germany, which by the end of the Second World War were pariahs. They were despised and detested by every right-minded individual on the planet. Today, according to my research and much other research, they're amongst the two most admired nations on the planet. Now, that took 70 years, well, 40, 50 years perhaps, before it really started happening. And it was as a result of the way that they started behaving differently in the international community. I don't want to talk forever on this basic definition point, but a point I would like to raise is this. Come about 2012, and I've been working with many governments on this issue, and they kept on saying, we understand what doesn't work. You tell us that bragging about our assets or our achievements is a waste of money. So what does work? And so I thought, well, fair question. What does work? So I took the complete database of my survey, the Nation Brands Index, which by then was over 1 billion data points. And I spent nearly a year analyzing it and asking it the simple question, what is the driver of a good image? Why do people admire country A more than country B? And the surprise discovery was that the biggest reason why people admire one country more than another is because they perceive it does more good in the world outside its own borders. Nothing to do with how beautiful or talented or successful or wealthy or prosperous or advanced it is, because people don't care. They don't live there. It doesn't interest them. But they do want to know what it contributes to the world.
I think that's a very important point. And Natasha Graham from Instead in the UK, do you accept that is what's at stake here? It's about the sort of reputation that our country has outside of its borders and actually showing evidence of that as well.
Well, for a start, I think, to pick up that point about the activity, I think the officials very often, they're usually civil servants responsible for promoting tourism, or sometimes government officials in charge of economy or investment attraction. They actually do want to do something about helping their country and doing their job well, so they feel they ought to be doing something, and it's rightly so. And secondly, they very rarely have those multi-million pound budgets. Very often they have very little budgets, and they think, but what can we do here? And what Simon has been doing so far with good nation index, good brand and good country index is a very important, a very good job for the world altogether. But maybe there is something to be said for places that are less known and people who are in the position not necessarily to change to turn the governmental ship straight away. They may be not the president, they might be just sort of third-tier civil servant. What can they do in their position? And what we're saying is that indeed they cannot do a glossy picture, but they need to offer a meaning. Like what John was saying about associations, it's more than just associations. I think places are now where commercial brands were maybe in the 1980s, when they couldn't compete on the quality of products anymore, and they started competing on meaning. Like Nike is just do it, right? It's not about sports equipment anymore. And similarly, especially in the more economically successful world, infrastructure is pretty much the same everywhere. If you want to attract top talent, you can't just say that you have good nurseries, good education, and maybe green parks. You need to tell people what it would tell others about them if they decide to relocate, say, to Finland. What would it tell about their own values? So we very often say that we don't, if you say brand places, we brand people. We help explain what makes people in this particular land, a territory, what they're good at. And in a way, it sounds very simple, but in fact, it's a process of helping the people in the location themselves first understand, well, become conscious themselves of themselves as a nation. What is it that holds us together? What is it that we can offer to the world? And sometimes they're big, good values like recycling or You know, in Denmark, we have a good example, Billund, for example, the town where Lego started. They don't talk of themselves as the city of Lego. They say, we will be the world's best town for children. And it doesn't mean that they only have good children's infrastructure. They involve children in decision making. They encourage businesses to have open days and show children their production. So they take leadership in this issue. But this is a global theme. However, on many locations, people don't need to, at the moment, are not ready to reach there. They just need to say, you know, we're introverted people who are good at technology. On others would say, we're actually mad creative artists and we can contribute that to the world.
Okay, Natasha Graham, thanks for that from the Institute for Identity in the UK. Let's go over to Costa Rica on the other side of the Atlantic, and Daniel Valverde, who's the Nation Brand Director at Essential Costa Rica. Of course, Daniel, Essential Costa Rica is widely regarded in the industry as a successful brand, successful campaign. Just tell us the kind of thinking behind Essential Costa Rica and how much of this was about branding people and how much of it was about branding places. Oh, Daniel, I think you're on mute. I can't hear you. We'll just see if we can hear Daniel now. Can you hear me, Daniel? Okay. We can't hear Daniel for the moment, so let's just go back to John Tipple at Future Brand. John, do you go along with this, that actually it is more about the people and having some sort of cause rather than just trying to brand one place?
I think it's a little bit what Simon was saying. It's more about doing than telling. And I think, you know, I really buy that point about behavior. And I think that, you know, I think that when countries are physically doing things, it creates momentum, and it does. And I do think countries can change their image, they can change their perception. The highest rising country on our index last year was Angola, which surprised us. But why? Because it's more seen as more politically stable, been investing in technology, and these stories resonate. You know, people are looking for, and when I say, you know, we've talked a lot about people here, there are obviously different audiences that countries might, you know, seek to attract. Sometimes it's inward investment and business. Sometimes it's people who you're wanting to come and study. Sometimes it's tourists. So thinking carefully about who you're trying to attract and the type of stories you tell them related to the things that you're doing, I think do make a huge difference. And, you know, that is more than just the slapping on of image. It's also more than just talking about your people. I think countries are made up of this, you know, very complex tapestry of people, place, history. You know, we look at it in 6 contexts. You know, we think about, tourism. So how good is it for food and holidays? We think about it in terms of, you know, business potential, quality of life. And I think, you know, things like, you know, for example, COVID will make people think about, even if you're selling them a holiday, they'll want to know not just how amazing it is, but also how safe it is, how hygienic it is, what the infrastructure is. What if I get ill? All of these broader considerations will come in. How will I be treated? And, you know, sustainability we haven't touched on yet, but, you know, people, and I'm sure Daniel will talk about it when his mic works, you know, more than I, you know, more an expert than me. But I think the idea of giving this rounded, you know, view of a place with its people seems to make the difference and can shift the dial. Certainly for countries that are less well known, they can grow more easily. Countries that are more entrenched in their image, absolutely. And I think it's harder to turn around the image of a US, a UK, a China, because, you know, we have so many deep associations that these things do take a long time to turn around. So I think it's a combination of a bunch of things, and looking at your country or brand, you know, against the audiences you're trying to engage. You know, India is a great example of a country that scores very highly on things like heritage and history and people wanting to visit there, but doesn't score so highly on things like business potential, which creates huge opportunities for some of the businesses and companies that are there to promote India as a place to do business. So you can begin to see the intersections between commercial interests and a country interest beginning to grow as well. So it's more complex. It's quite a complex thing to consider.
Okay, John from Future Brand, thank you very much indeed for that. If you're just joining us in the audience there, thank you very much indeed for joining us for this Euronews debate today. It's called Nation Branding in a Changing World. Nice to have you along. I want to say hello to Fame Thompson and Nafisa Shafi, who have been joining us, and they're watching us on YouTube. Thank you very much indeed for your questions. I'll be putting those to the panel a bit later on. And if anybody else has any questions for any of our panelists during this discussion today, we've got about 40 minutes left, and do leave them in the comment section, and we'll get round to some of those a bit later on. I want to try and go back to Daniel now in Costa Rica, Nation Brand Director at Central Costa Rica. Can you hear me okay, Daniel?
I think.
Yay! Great.
Yeah, okay, I'm here.
I built you up so much being in Costa Rica and everything, and then we couldn't hear you. But anyway, Daniel, great to see you. You're the nation brand director at Essential Costa Rica. Widely regarded as a successful campaign, in the industry. We've been talking a lot today so far about what nation branding means. Is it about people? Is it about places? What is it about it? When you were kind of nurturing and developing Essential Costa Rica, what was it about for you?
Well, I wouldn't dare to go into semantics, because I'm not a consultant either, an academic. So, but what I like to say is that what my team does is actually go through actions, activities, public policies that usually in the long run will help close the gap between what the country is all about and what our key markets, our key audiences know about it. So that's merely the focus of what we do. Now, there's quite a big difference between what place branding or is, or what we have been talking about, and place marketing, which is something different, but is closely related to. I think there's a lot of things about what Simon said is practically the misconception about the two terms, and they're completely separate from each other.
So in terms of Essential Costa Rica, I mean, what have been the values of that? And what have you been trying to do to promote Costa Rica as a destination, not only for tourism, but also for business, I guess?
Well, in that case, we're talking about place marketing tactics. So my team, what it does is works closely between 5 different institutions, one of these being the Tourism Bureau, and they're in charge of actually promoting the country as a destination. So what they use the narrative that we have developed for this Essential Costa Rica project.
I wish I was on that beach right now that we're seeing.
we all.
It'd be better than a work from home office/bedroom.
I'm about 1 hour and a half drive to that beach, but
I don't want to know.
Or that lake as well. So we are not into in that kind of thing in terms of place marketing as a destination. We're not only tackling the beauty and the scenery, but we'll also talk about the sustainable concern of the population regarding protecting the environment and how we have achieved this over decades now to provide our tourists great offer, but also a very valuable one when it comes to caring about not only Costa Rica's environment, but the whole wide world.
And Daniel, with the impact of COVID-19, the pandemic having such a huge impact on many countries around the world, both in tourism and foreign direct investment, what impact has there been in Costa Rica? How resilient have you been? And can you see going forward in terms of branding and marketing that you're going to have to change things or not?
Well, 2 different questions there, but in terms of performance, the country has managed to have business continuity in terms of FDI and exports. So actually we had 2020 that had over 4% of increase in exports, and the FDI were still creating jobs for the majority of the population, and companies from abroad install facilities and open facilities within the country. So the problem is tourism, but that's a global problem. And it has, if you compare the last quarter of 2020 to the last quarter of 2019, we were performing about we were receiving about 1/3 of the tourists. So for sure, there's a lot to be done, but that's more on performance, on place promotion.
But do you think that also has an impact on reputation and image as well? I mean, maybe in Costa Rica, if you've not had such a bad time of COVID, but then other countries around the world have, and they're perceived to have maybe not handled it in a great way. Does that also play into this going forward?
Well, I think the people, in terms of visiting, around the world are changing their perception about how they choose a destination for tourism. Before COVID, probably tourist health concern was only if they could drink tap water. I don't know, something like that. From now on, it will be totally different. The access to medical healthcare, or I don't know,
but
stuff like that will be very
well. Just be, but the access to medical healthcare and all those sorts of things, of course, it will be an issue for some people. But maybe that's just going to be a short-term thing. Do you think COVID can have a lasting impact on a country's
It depends on
reputation?
how COVID is going to stay. I mean, it's very uncertain to say, because remember that we have been talking about the long term. I mean, this is kind of a strategies happen and will deliver in the long run, not in the short term. As Simon said, from one year to another is practically something that you cannot perceive. I mean, the change over any kind of action, activity, or public policy that will impact the reputation of a place. So for us, from my point of view, I don't think yet it's too well. I think it's too soon to talk about the impact of COVID in the reputation of places in terms of place branding. Okay, it depends on how this will stay for the longer run.
Yeah, okay. It depends on what happens in the future, and a lot of us, we don't know what's going to happen with COVID, do we, in the pandemic, and how well the world is going to recover. Let's go back to Simon Anholt, policy advisor who's worked with many governments and organizations right around the world. Simon, do you think that COVID will have an impact on image, reputation, branding of countries? Because maybe there will be some countries that come out of this better than others in terms of all of that.
It's unlikely, and the evidence so far is that it won't. So the Nation Brands Index was released last year, as it is every year, around about September, and there was no difference to the normal ranking. It is the most boring social survey ever conducted, basically because nobody ever changes their minds about countries. The only thing that changed last year was that China had dropped by quite a large number of places. And that was mainly because of Donald Trump telling everybody that it was the China virus. Otherwise, very little change. And the reason for that, I think, is pretty clear now after publishing and studying this index now for getting on for 20 years. It's pretty clear that most people around the world are not very interested in the domestic affairs of other countries. There are too many of them. Last time I checked, there were over 200 countries on Earth. And if we spent our time worrying about whether we should change our minds about other countries, we'd have no time left to do anything else. And
yeah, so but surely, Simon, if somebody thinks that a country's got their politics wrong, if they perceive them as maybe persecuting certain people in society, the politics or social unrest, surely people are going to think, well, maybe I wouldn't want to go to that country because I don't really believe in what they do.
Well, go to that country, I think, is a different topic. And this is what Daniel just explained, I think, very well. If you're talking about tourism, if you're talking about people's short-term intention to visit a country or to invest in it or to move, to study, to live there, then that's a very different matter. And that is to some degree susceptible to marketing. If you want more tourists, you do more advertising, you get more tourists. I mean, tourism is an idiot business from that point of view. It's a very, very straight correlation between how well you promote it and how successfully you sell it. But I don't think we're talking about tourism here primarily. It's obviously connected. But what we're really talking about here is the overall image of the country that people around the world have in their minds. And all the evidence is that the vast majority of people just don't know and don't care and don't think about what goes on domestically in other countries, how they treat their minorities, for example. The majority of people on the planet never watch international news. They're just, it's sometimes quite difficult for well-educated, well-traveled people to understand this, but they're in a very, very small minority. And the overwhelming majority of people out there don't know and don't care. So the fact that New Zealand, for example, may have coped with the pandemic very well, it doesn't affect my image of New Zealand. If I hear about it, it reinforces something that I already believed about New Zealand, that they're a pretty remote island, easy to cut themselves off from the rest of the world, pretty well-run society, fine. What's changed? Nothing's changed at all. And if you tell me tomorrow that Guatemala has been the most successful country on earth at managing the pandemic, it doesn't concern me because I don't live in Guatemala.
And how about from a business and investment perspective, is it the same?
Well, again, you see, you're talking about sector-specific promotion there. If you're talking about encouraging investment, then we go back to the marketing and we go back to targeted audiences and we go back to communications. Of course, business people are much more aware of these things. And of course, what they know will affect their investment decisions. Investment, actually, I doubt it, because investors know that the pandemic is going to be over at some stage. But the general image of the country, and after all, we are talking about nation branding today. We're not talking about tourism promotion or investment promotion. When we're talking about nation branding, it's the only time people are ever going to notice or perhaps revisit their views of another country is if that country reaches out and does something that affects the world that I live in. So a Danish newspaper publishes a series of cartoons lampooning the Prophet Muhammad back in 2005, and that causes pretty much the majority of all Muslims in the world to start strongly disliking and disapproving of Denmark. that has an impact on its image, because it seems to many Muslims that Denmark, the state, has reached out and offended their religion. But if Denmark is just carrying on doing its own business, managing the epidemic well or badly, doing more trade, less trade, treating its own citizens well or badly, nobody notices and nobody cares. It doesn't have an impact on its image.
Okay, Simon, let's go back to Natasha Grand at the Institute for Identity in the UK. Natasha, nice to see you back with us. What do you make of what Simon's saying there? I mean, you're originally from Belarus and you've worked with a lot of governments and organizations in that region of the world. Do you go along with what Simon's saying about all of this? Oh, can you take yourself off mute, please, Natasha? Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Can you hear me now? So
yeah.
Simon and John made a very fair point that COVID being a common problem for the world exposed the differences in national characters, if you like, and in most cases have confirmed them. So like British being law-abiding, Italians like in opera, and Estonians being very progressive with 2 women in the helm of the country. But very interestingly, the national character plays out in other ways. So in Belarus, as you mentioned, people are very health aware. And the president tried to go against this national character by trying to ignore the epidemic at all, altogether. He has faced a massive social backlash that he has never seen in the previous 26 years of his rule, which hasn't put an end to it, but certainly brought it much closer. And I think in this, so far, we have been talking a lot about the external image of the country, but let's not forget that branding is also important internally. If not, it starts with within, and it matters for it won't be successful externally unless people within a country, within a place, know what they're about, what inspires them. And if you like, all their communication agencies, if they sing from the same hymn sheet. For example, you know that maybe United States or France are the most visited places in the world, but the most successful nation brand to me is undoubtedly Finland, because although they have a very cold climate, dark hours for half of the year, not many people, not many cultural artifacts, but they have the world's highest proportion of tech startups per capita, and they attract, in terms of tourism, more than their own population size worth every year. And why is it? Because they have a very strong sense of what the Finnish way of life is. They have education their own way, they have industry their own way, and what they've always selling is exactly that. Their campaigns have been Rent a Finn or a 90-day Finn, in which people, if you apply and you're successful, you can relocate to Finland and try what it is like to live in Finland with your spouse, with your children put in the nurseries and schools, everything taken care of. Try it out. Do you like it? If you like our way of life, come and relocate. So branding to me is very much an internal work before you come out to the world and say who you are. People need to become interesting to themselves. And in many places around the world, they're not. They think they don't have anything interesting about them. They don't have artifacts. They don't have much to attract others. So they just feel sorry for themselves that they're not California or London. And they're wrong, of course. There is something very interesting about every nation. But to them, it's usually the most mundane things, and they don't see it for themselves.
Because, Natasha, at the end of the day, who decides on what a country looks like in terms of its brand, image, reputation? You talked there about concentrating internally in the people, having that identity first. But do the real people actually get to decide what their identity is in the international stage?
That's a very interesting question. And because what happens very often, Damien, that people, like I said, civil servants who are not politicians, who are often not opinion leaders, but they have to go to a tourism show, they have to work at an investment exhibition, and they have to say something. So they end up working out what they should be saying about their nation. Of course, people should be involved. It's best practice everywhere to consult stakeholders. However, there's a very big caveat there, which we discovered in our work, is that people, even if you ask people, what do you like, what's important, they either say that they're very nice people, which doesn't give you much, or they tend to say what is hardest for them to be. Like I said, creative people would say they're very organized. People in Siberia say that they're great fun. Like introverted Central Europeans would say that they're very friendly. Finns say that they're full of contrast. So they actually, like that, what I say, you need often, and I'm a consultant and I would say that, but you need a critical observer who would be able to listen to people and put what they think about themselves in a global and regional context.
Okay, Natasha Grand from the Institute for Identity, thank you very much indeed for that. If you're just joining us, if you're just watching our Euronews debate this afternoon, this session is called Nation Branding in a Changing World. We've got a great lineup of guests for you. You're just seeing there discussing this topic. And thanks very much to all of you who are getting involved, all of you watching and for submitting your questions. Thank you to Innovation Spotlight and also Leonardo Nieto. Thank you for your questions. And we'll be asking the questions just a bit later on towards the end of this session, so keep sending them in. Just leave them in the comment section just below the video where you're watching. Let's go back to John Tipple of Future Brand. John, thanks again for joining us today. We've heard all sorts of things here about what makes up nation branding, marketing, promotion, sales. Is all quite confusing, but at the end of the day, do the governments and countries really know what they're doing with all of this? Because yeah, you might have a group of civil servants that want to do something, but maybe they don't know what they're actually going to do. What's the sort of decision-making process around that within countries, and what's the sort of role between public and private partners in terms of bringing all that together?
Well, I think that's one of the issues. These things aren't often brought together. I mean, I think that you typically find, and Natasha was mentioning civil servants, I mean, marketing and brand and is potentially not their core area of interest or expertise. So you typically find that these things are often quite piecemeal, and I think it's quite significant that it's, and I don't mean this in any disrespect to Costa Rica, but tends to be the smaller, more aligned, more connected countries that are able to make more headway when it comes to the way they're presented to the world. And because I suspect there are fewer stakeholders, there's a more common vision and a more common aspiration for what you want to be. When you get to countries that are potentially more established, there are more vested, more interests, more competing for budgets, and actually, you know, there's not a lot of money often available for the type of brand work that you might want to do to begin to drive and change perceptions of a country, which, you know, to Simon's point, is about a hell of a lot more than marketing. The one thing I would say, you know, that we haven't really spoken about is if we look into the future, and I think if we think about some of the younger generations coming through, because we don't often pick those up on the research that we do. They're not yet, you know, having necessarily the influence that they might be having. And I think when you look at those generations, I think you see a fundamental change in view about what a nation is and what it stands for. These are people who've grown up naturally thinking in borderless ways. They aren't necessarily bound up with some of the prejudices that we inherited from our parents, particularly at Christmas time. And so you find yourself, they find themselves a little bit more naturally fluid about the way that the world works, where they might want to go, how they see things. And, I was talking to friends of my daughters who was basically saying that they think the only point of countries is for World Cups. Other than that, what's the point for sport? Otherwise, what's the point of countries? So it might be that as we move forward, and I think in a reaction to COVID, when everyone's been not allowed to travel, there'll be this desire to go out there, to connect, to see people, to begin to not behave in ways that are stoked up in the past, that are dictated by perceptions and traditions that have been inherited. So I think we might see a change as we move forward.
And how will countries need to communicate with those younger generations? Is it going to be a change of strategy? Because younger people, well, all of us these days have a lot of access to a lot of information, right?
Well, I mean, this is where there is a commonality between country brands and all brands. You have to practice what you preach. Countries that say they stand for something and you turn up in that country and it's a different experience, that'll quickly be communicated. And so the ability to connect what you stand for as a country or what you want to stand for, which, obviously is, has, there are all sorts of different ways to do that. But if I was to give you the example of Switzerland, which is seen to be, beautiful, ordered, lots to do, quite affluent, if you go there and it's that type of experience and you have that and you feel secure and safe, then that reaffirms your view of Switzerland. If you go to, say, Brazil, which has got an image of kind of fun, party, slightly chaotic, if you have, but warm, and if you go there and you have that experience, then that will deliver that. It's when you get a disconnect between what a brand says it's all about and you go to the country and have a completely different experience. That's when the wheels come off. And I think with the younger generations, but also not just an age thing, people these days are less tolerant of that sort of inconsistency. Also, when money and time is less available, people want to make sure that the places they go to study or the places they want to invest for business live up to the expectation of what they thought they were buying into. So I think the onus is on countries to make sure there's a real tight connection between what they say they stand for and the experience on the ground. Much easier to say than to do, but that's kind of great because that's for businesses like us.
John, that's a really important point, and I think this brings us on to the topic of trust. And if I can go back to Daniel in Costa Rica, at Essential Costa Rica, the nation brand director there. Daniel, how much do you accept that these days, that it is about trust? Because you can talk the talk, but you've got to walk the walk.
For sure, but it's something it's not recent. Actually, it's been there for ages.
The markets and audiences are even more demanding of it now, aren't they?
Yeah, it is because they have more information available, so they can easily find out. And that's not only for place brands, but also for any single brand around the world. If what you're saying is not true, or I don't know if you're some sort of a scam. But what I like to say, what I like to tackle is the fact that when you want to start a project such like this, you have to start with the right mapping. And for that, research is very important. You need to understand, first of all, which are your key markets, where are you going to? I mean, it will be pointless just to be relevant or expect that the whole world will know exactly the same about your country, because you don't have that many bridges to every single country around the world. I mean, it will be, for instance, I don't know, let's say Australia. What people in Australia will know about Costa Rica, well, I don't know if they will know much about it as, I don't know, for instance, Panama, which is a next door neighbor. So we started out with research. We hired this company, QRI. In fact, from that moment, this relationship between QRI and Future Brand came to be. I think John will talk about later. And then understanding the perception, how we were perceived, was very important before we started thinking about what actions, activities, I don't know, public policies will be in the making for in terms of promoting the country as a destination, as a place to buy products from or invest in. So from my point of view, I think all those kind of efforts can only be reliable if you have the right narrative and you can only talk about things you already own. And that's the thing. I mean, the brand itself has been in the making for, in the case of Costa Rica, for 200 years. But the fact that the media right now, the internet, everything has changed dramatically in the recent years, it doesn't mean that the country has to be very considerate about only talking about things they own. I mean, it has always been there. I mean, it's because eventually the idea behind it is that people have an experience either for visiting, investing, or buying products from. So that's my point.
And Daniel, you mentioned earlier on the word sustainability, which has obviously become an increasingly important word in all sorts of sectors around the world. Obviously, sustainability is something that countries are concentrating on a lot these days, in many aspects of business, but also in tourism. With Costa Rica, I know sustainability is really important, but is it causes like that? If we talk back about tourists once again, is it going to be things like that, the cause of sustainability and your commitment to the green issues and all those sorts of things, that is actually going to encourage people to want to visit your country? If we just talk about tourists for a moment, because many tourists these days, right, they want to have immersive, authentic experiences, but they want to leave a positive footprint.
Well, the thing about sustainability is we can talk about hours about it, because right now...
we don't have longer, unfortunately.
We only have some
next time.
But the thing about sustainability is that it has acquired traction over the last decade, but Costa Rica has been taking important decisions regarding it for over, I don't know, probably 50 years now. So obviously, right now, the thing is that about climate change and stuff like that, well, have been very, very, very important, because the world has been actually getting the right information about the importance of this. So going back to Simon and what he talked about being a good country and stuff like that, obviously is no other than, if you take a look at the 17 SDGs out there, many of the things that Simon says a good country does are completely embraced and introspected into the SDGs, because it's actually something the whole world community has agreed of following. So obviously the best performers in that acquire better relevance, and that goes across the board for not only tourism but also the products you buy from. Either those are goods or services. Buyers are more concerned about the tracing of this offer. I mean, if the company producing that has a sustainable commitment towards sustainability. Obviously, if you are aiming to do business with a company in Costa Rica as a result of the reputation of the country worldwide, you will expect that these companies will have acquired this commitment as well. And that goes for the same for investment.
Okay. All right, Daniel, thanks very much indeed for that. Let's just go back to Simon Anholt, policy advisor, who's worked with many governments and organizations around the world. You mentioned this briefly earlier, Simon, but going forward then, in a post-COVID world, do you really think it is going to be about countries having a cause, a tangible cause, and they show evidence of tackling that cause that really is going to influence people's mindsets?
Yes, all the evidence points that way, and there's really very little doubt about it. Whoever you ask, John mentioned the younger generation, and I can confirm that it's particularly noticeable in the younger generation, which suggests that it's an effect that's going to increase over time. You know, Damon, one of the reasons why I personally get a little bit impatient with some of these conversations about nation branding is because I sit back and I listen to them and I think to myself, this is all incredibly 80s. You know, this is like the Wolf of Wall Street. It's countries putting on their red suspenders and saying, how can we achieve an advantage or ascendancy or power over the other nations? It's America first and Germany first and Britain first. And this is just incredibly unwise and incredibly outdated and almost suicidal. We're in a stage of human history where we're facing massive existential challenges. The pandemic is right in front of us. So even if you don't believe in climate change, you have to believe in the pandemic. And there's inequality, and there's poverty, and there's racism, and there's terrorism, and there's fundamentalism, and there's nuclear proliferation, and species loss, and habitat loss, and water shortages, and anything you can think of. This is the moment that we're in history. And when I hear countries, particularly rich countries, saying, do I look good in this? Can I make myself, can I get a better image than some of these other countries? I just feel like saying to these countries, come on, get real. This isn't the way that life on Earth works these days. Of course, you still need to earn foreign revenues. Of course, you still promote for tourism and promote for investment. But it isn't anymore about being the most brilliant, the most successful. It's about engaging with the international community, working as a group of nations to tackle the challenges that affect us and affect all of us. The gold standard of good governance in the 21st century is countries that can harmonize their domestic and their international responsibilities to do the right thing for their own people and to do the right thing for the rest of the world. And the irony is that that's the only way to earn a better image. If you do that, then people admire you. But if you aim for image directly, you just look like a sad loser.
Okay, interesting perspective there, Simon. Thank you very much indeed for that. Before we go to our questions from the audience, Natasha, just a final question to you. What do you make of what Simon's saying there? And actually, I was reading on your website, you'd written an article about what things might be like in a post-COVID world. You were talking about the fact that actually, even though we've all been in lockdowns and sort of isolation, it might have actually brought the world closer together. And you were sort of saying our lives will be immensely richer, I'm quoting here, from the variety of new places will make themselves known. I mean, what is your perspective briefly on the post-COVID world?
I think nobody could argue with what Simon has just said about the importance of being good and working together. I think the qualifier that I would add to that is that before you can make a contribution, you really need to assess what you're good at and what you can offer the world. Because, look, we all say drink tea, but the teapot in Britain and the teapot in China are two very different things and two very different ceremonies. And going back to what John has said about the young people also being particularly keen on seeing through lies and seeking genuine experiences, I think it all boils down to the fact that before the nation even tries to do anything outside, they need to understand what is their way of life, what is their genuine way of life and what a genuine contribution they can make to the world. And from that, we get all that incredible diversity of nations extroverts, introverts, nations engineers, nations artists. And also we can come, I think now the places can also come to people through their products, through their manufacturing, through the creativity. One last short point is that the furlough time has not been a frozen time. I mean, the amount of people who've gone and started a small business has been quite interesting as well. And you have a lot of nascent creativity bubbling up from the ground. So it would be interesting for the governments to try and capture it and see how the people see the place themselves and try and communicate this to the world.
Okay, Natasha, don't go anywhere because I've got some questions from our audience here that I'm going to put to some of you. Thank you very much to all of you for sending them in for this session today, Nation Branding in a Changing World, our latest Euronews Debate session. Natasha, I'm going to bring you straight back in, actually. I've got a question that's come through the Euronews.com website from somebody that's talking about Italy in particular. They're saying, what steps can Italy take to solidify its cultural identity while adopting policies to become more welcoming to foreign investors, students, workers, people wishing to live in the country? So how does a country sort of open up to the world, but also maintain its cultural identity?
I think you cannot open up without having the cultural identity this way. Basically, the recipe for any country is very simple as far as we see it. Know yourself, do what you do best, and make it available for the world to buy. So Italy, if you have a same understanding of what people enjoy and love doing in Italy, and they do it and communicate it from any ways possible, whether it's a young blogger writing about something they've just drawn, or whether it's an Italian manufacturer, whether it's an opera house. The idea is that there should be as many outlets and as many sources just projecting that image of what it is that makes us Italians, what makes us, and celebrates that way of life.
Okay, I would add one thing. I would add one thing to that, Dave, which is there is an opportunity to proactively welcome people. I mean, I heard the example of, I think Milan actively set up a welcome center for people who were coming to study, coming to live in Milan. And, you know, a lot of people are going to places like that because it's too expensive to go to London and New York. So cities like Milan are coming up the consideration set. But countries like Milan, places like Milan are in many ways, we know less about them. We know less about those places, and they can be difficult to navigate when you arrive. And I think those first experiences can be incredibly fundamental to how you feel about the total experience. But if you go to a place like Milan, which you don't know that well, you feel welcomed, there is somewhere to go, you know how to pay your taxes, you know where to register for your kids to go to kindergarten. There are things you can proactively do to make that welcome period actually a really positive experience that then has a knock-on effect and creates that positive momentum. So I think, yes, understand what it is that makes Italy, Italy, and I probably Milan, and there's lots of Italys, of course. But after that, there are proactive things that can be done to make people feel genuinely welcomed and aware of what they, understand places, because what's obvious to the country is really confusing to people when they arrive.
I think Scandinavian countries are particularly good at that kind of soft landing that John
Absolutely.
mentioned.
Yeah.
So
soft
to go
landing,
there
great,
for examples.
Yeah.
Okay, great. We've got to move on because I've got quite a few questions to get through here. This one is saying, considering the Paris Agreement, EU countries need to develop economic plans less focused on short-term tourism. Do you have any ideas for building an economy based on things other than tourism? So actually, Daniel, at Costa Rica, when we think of Costa Rica, yes, there's tourism, but your economy is built on much more than that. Some people might be interested to know that actually you have a big medical tech sector, don't you?
Yeah, we do. Over 17% of our exports are medical devices nowadays. Actually, is the greatest export in Costa Rica is actually that one, not anymore coffee or banana or I don't know, agricultural products. The thing is that, responding to that, of course, if you intend to deliver something, well, to send something outside to export, or to develop exports, FDI, or tourism itself, it goes beyond just the fact of visiting, buying from, or investing. I think we have been hearing for quite a time now the importance that the consumer has been changing their selection patterns, and they're more concerned about the purpose, the traceability of everything involved in such activities. And for that, if the country owns already a positive image towards sustainable initiatives, then there will be expected that the tourism offer, the exports or the FDI opportunities will be full of that as well.
Okay, Daniel. Simon, let's put this one to you. I'm not asking you to be an economist or a financial expert on this, but this person, Fane Thompson, is asking via YouTube, what about the tourist dollar worldwide? Post-COVID, is that dollar going to shrink or expand? And how will, for example, tourist destinations compete in a post-COVID world in that sort of scenario?
Well, there's a big question mark over tourism at the moment. And perhaps it was a question mark that always had to be there, and the pandemic has just brought it forward a little bit. Tourism is and has been for a long time a highly problematic industry because it creates a great deal of pollution. It tends to do much less than it claims to reduce inequalities. And in many cases, it causes enormous amount of social as well as environmental damage. You've got highly over-visited cities like Amsterdam and Venice beginning to get to the stage now where it's creating enormous friction between the long-term residents and the temporary residents who are coming there either as tourists or as migrants. And let's never forget, going back to the previous point, when we're talking about places being welcoming, there's something immensely hypocritical about countries that spend enormous amounts of money being welcoming to tourists, but don't do the same for migrants who are there not in their own choice. But tourism was long overdue for a rethink. And in a way, I think, although it's suffering and the countries that depend on it are suffering greatly at the moment, it's probably no bad thing that they're now being forced to question, how can we make it more sustainable? How can we make it more green? How can we make it more useful and more meaningful? And the answers are there. I've no doubt that tourism can continue to exist in some form. It won't be as easy to make money out of it as it was in the past. I wouldn't like to have shares in cruise liners at the moment, but I think there's potential for the future of tourism.
Okay, Simon, great. John, just briefly, just a final question from our audience because we're running out of time. I know Future Brand has worked a fair bit in South America. Leonardo Nieto is asking, how can cities like Bogota in Colombia that don't have such a good perception due to their history and the image that's still being reproduced in the media, Leonardo is saying, how can cities like Bogota compete to be relevant in the new future?
Well, I think it's a great question. And I think the exciting things for places like that is that there are newer and newer generations, and also the older generation looking for more holidays and more experiences and more opportunities to travel beyond the well-trodden pathways. So places like Bogota are becoming more interesting to people. I believe Medellin has done a really good job in changing its perception by telling different stories and showcasing things that are there that don't fit in with the cliche that gets portrayed, through TV and through other mediums that, assume a city has only, or a place has only one context. So I think it's about opening up those places to an audience that really wants to go to places other people don't go to. This whole idea of discovering places is a really big idea amongst a lot of people these days. We don't want to go to the places other people go to. I think tourism, to Simon's point just now, is becoming a much broader concept. People are looking at volunteering opportunities. People are working in more mobile, more remote ways. So being able to blend a life of work with volunteering, with travel and experience creates a ready market. And above all else, we want to go to places other people haven't been to before that maybe have a sort of a bit of an edge to them. And I think bringing that through is a fantastic thing to do, because we want to go to new places and have new experiences all the time.
Okay, John, thanks for that. Just before we go, just got a couple of minutes. I'm just going to get a final thought from each of you. And if you can keep it to just under 30 seconds, that would be absolutely fantastic. Natasha Gran, looking forward in terms of the post-COVID world, is the world going to have an identity crisis, or is this going to be a world of opportunity after this?
It depends on what we do about it, but it certainly would be helpful not to be ashamed of yourself, not to try to make Bogota look like Los Angeles, of course, but it's an opportunity for soul searching exercise, and it has to start with, it's just like teenagers at some point go to a career advisor and say, what will I be good at as for my job? I think we all have to look inward before we look outward and see what we can do for the world and for ourselves.
Okay, great. Daniel in Costa Rica, final thought from you, 25 seconds.
No, the thing is that my advice, I think the most valuable thing I can say is that the importance of avoiding the self-image bias when you're trying to create some sort of project about developing or concerning about your place brand. And for that, research is key. And and also focusing on the key markets you're tackling. Great.
Simon, final thought from you very briefly.
Going back to that question from Bogota, what can we do? The wrong question is, what can we say to make ourselves famous? The right question is, what can we do to make ourselves relevant? So I say this to any government I ever talk to, city, country, or region. What is your gift to the world? Why should a random person in some other country feel glad that you exist? That's the only question that's worth answering.
Okay. And John Tipple, final thought?
Don't be afraid to experiment. Try things. These countries have been around for hundreds of years. They're not going to break. Have a plan by all means, but try lots of interesting things and see what people gravitate towards. The world's an interesting place, and people want all sorts of different things. So, try, as I say, experiment.
Great. John Tipple, Global Chief Strategy Officer at FutureBrand. Thank you very much indeed for joining us today. Pleasure to speak to you.
Likewise, pleasure.
Simon Anholt, Policy Advisor. Thanks for joining us as well from the UK.
Thanks, Damon.
Daniel in Costa Rica, thanks for your input today.
Pura vida.
Thank you. And Natasha Grand, the Institute for Identity. Great talking to you. Thanks very much indeed for joining us as well.
Thank you and goodbye.
Great. And thanks very much for everybody that's watched, and thanks to everybody that sent in questions as well. We got through as many as we could. A really fascinating debate there, isn't it, about the future of nation branding right around the world, particularly in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic. Thanks once again for watching. Stay safe, and we'll see you again soon.